It's a great pleasure to have here at the Institute of Economics during the celebrations of its 5th anniversary, the well-known and heterodox economist, Professor Ha-Joon Chang from the University of Cambridge. Professor Chang was born in South Korea and is author of several books translated into many languages worldwide, where he questions through different historical examples the conventional approach to economics, namely the neoclassical theory. His most recent book is Economics, a User Guide. Thank you so much, Professor Chang, for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Great. So let's start with your last book. What did you try to show in that book, and why did you think it was important to identify different approaches to economics?
Yes. Well, the book has a number of different purposes. I mean, of course, it's just one book, but it has different layers, if you like. So the first purpose was to, well, if you like, democratize economics. So, I sometimes joke that neoclassical economics today plays the role that Catholic theology played in medieval Europe. It's become an ideology that justifies whatever status quo there is. And they have, made it impossible for ordinary people to understand economics by using huge amount of mathematics and jargons and complicated statistics. So a lot of people just don't think that they can understand economics, and they are reluctant to engage in economic debate. But in my view, it is the duty of a citizen in a democracy to know some economics so that they can engage in debate on economic issues, because economic issues are so central to how the society works, and that even if you are not interested in companies making money and there being productivity growth and stuff like that, and only interested in promoting culture or developing philosophical argument, all these things that are affected by economic decisions. The government cuts budgets for universities, or it gives more money to promote the indigenous culture or whatever. These things all are related to economic issues. So I think it is very important that everyone knows some economics and engages in the economic debate. So the first purpose of this book was to introduce economics in a way that is comprehensible to people who haven't had any sort of economics education. Now, making, therefore, the economics accessible, however, doesn't mean that it should be reduced to slogans, bullet points. So I try to go down to the very foundation of economics and discuss issues like what is economics? Can it be a science? What is the ethical foundation of economics? Can economics be separated from politics, or is just another disguised form of the political argument? So I deal with all these issues, and in making that point, it is very important to treat the readers as kind of mature, intelligent people. I'm not in the book trying to tell people this is how the world is, this is how the world should be, and you have to all follow my suggestions. No, I don't do that. So I try to encourage people to think critically of economic issues by themselves. So I'm trying to provide the tools to do that. And in doing that, this is the third layer of the book. I am trying to tell people what economics really is, what it could be, but how it has been reduced to this basically branch of applied mathematics with a lot of right-wing individualist prejudices. And but it doesn't have to be like that. And in seeing that point, it is very important to recognize that there are more than just one tradition in economics. The mainstream economists like to present themselves as basically the only people who have scientific understanding of the economy, and they have to be listened to. So that when someone raises a question about the value of free trade, they think that this person's from I don't know, Neolithic age. When someone raises questions about the virtue of low taxes, these economists think that these guys are insane. But no, actually there are many different types of economics, many different schools of economics that have very different views on how the economy works and how we should design policies and how people should live. And so, in the developing the critical faculty of the reader to understand the complexity of the world and complexity of economic theories, I think that telling them about all these different traditions in economics is very useful, because then they begin to see that, yes, it isn't actually like science where you put in one thing and something else comes out the other end. There are all sorts of philosophical debate involved, all sorts of political viewpoints are involved, and all sorts of different ways of how to understand the way technology changes, how technological changes affect, say, institutions, and institutions affect technological changes, how technological and institutional changes affect the individuals, and how they affect the broader society. So, I think that it is vital, if you are going to encourage people to think about economics in a critical way, it's vital that they know about these different traditions.
Great. That's great, because here at the Institute of Economics we share this view of how students should engage critically into the study of economics and sharing and knowing all different schools of thought that would be a good answer to different problems that our reality has. So now our second question would be that many mainstream economists like to oppose the idea of market and state as if there were two different categories. But to understand capitalism, it seems very important to note that this dichotomy is rather inexistent, and our efforts should concentrate in understanding the different sorts of relationships and interconnections developed between market and state over time and in different societies. What do you think about that?
In standard economic theory, basically the market and the state are seen as kind of polar opposites. So the market expands, the state shrinks, the state expands, the market shrinks. But this dichotomy is hugely problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, as I keep saying, it is the state that draws the boundary around the market. Of course, you can find very limited examples of markets existing in limited local areas because everyone knows everyone else, and that there's a kind of local authority so that they can intervene if there's a dispute, or you have dispersed the ethnic community across large geographical areas who are all linked with linked with each other by blood or by the close friendship. So in that kind of situation, the markets can exist without without the state. But in general, you need the state to come in and set down the basic parameters. So actually, without the market, without the state, the market usually cannot exist. And the second point is that follows from this first point, exactly because of this, the well-functioning markets actually require well-functioning states. So we've seen this in the transition of the former socialist economies into capitalism. They thought by abolishing the state, the market will just re-emerge, and the economy will become market economy more or less overnight. What they didn't realize was that a well-functioning market requires the state to enforce contract, to create the infrastructure for the market to operate, to regulate the market so it wouldn't destroy itself, regulate the market so that it doesn't kind of negatively affect the rest of human life. So without this, I mean, you then end up with a total chaos. So well-functioning markets require well-functioning state. But thirdly, when people talk about market and the state, they often conflate the market with the private sector. These two are different things. Because first of all, there are a lot of state-owned economic entities, like state-owned enterprises like Petrobras, or state-owned banks, or other types of state organizations that actually participate in the market. So this view that somehow, I mean, the state is an antithesis to the market is very misleading, because there are a lot of state-owned entities participating in the market economy. So if you say we need to promote the market, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to repress the state, because a lot of the actors in the market are actually state actors. And then also you have to realize that the state and the private sector agents that cooperate with each other, and actually in many countries this cooperation has been central to the economic successes. So, Peter Evans, who has written a lot about Brazil, but also a lot about South Korea, he's argued that the way the state bureaucracy in South Korea had what he called embedded autonomy, meaning that it was closely linked with the private sector, but was not controlled by the private sector, so it was autonomous, but that was not detached from the private sector. He argued that this relationship was very critical. A lot of the people point out that the relationship between the local government, the state government, rather than the federal government of Germany, and the private sector at the state level has been critical in the strength of the German economy, because this state government, they own certain financial institutions which provide finance for the small and medium-sized enterprises, and then these enterprises work with the state to provide research and development, worker training, education. So yes, I mean, when you actually look at the reality, the state often cooperates with private sector agents. So once again, I mean, thinking that in order to promote the private sector, you have to repress the state is completely wrong. And the final point is that the private sector agents themselves do not usually, do not always interact with each other through the market. Because in standard economics, that's the only thing they do. They compete in the market. But in reality, the private sector organizations cooperate with each other a lot. So sometimes they set up industry associations to provide collective inputs. Like they might set up a joint export marketing agency, or they might set up a joint R&D institute. I mean, sometimes they kind of create mechanisms in which they could kind of jointly own certain things. So the agricultural cooperatives are classic examples. Yeah? So independent farmers who own their own, I don't know, cows or land, they, however, pool resources to set up processing factories together. Yeah? They do marketing together. Yeah? So, the private sector agents do not actually necessarily compete with each other in the market. Yeah, they do a lot of that, but sometimes they actually cooperate outside the market. Yeah? So once again, I mean, this view that, if you somehow make market transactions easier, private sector firms will necessarily flourish is wrong, because they also need to find ways to cooperate with each other outside the market. I mean, the market competition is not the only thing that makes these enterprises productive.
And I would add or also comment that there is the political economy of this issue, like how enterprise with the state act with the state to adopt certain policies in benefit of themselves in certain sectors. So there's also this movement, so it's makes more difficult to think like separate.
That's right. Yeah.
Things.
So a lot of private sector companies that come together and try to lobby for their interest, and very often this affects government policy. So this brings us back to this Peter Evans' point on the embedded autonomy, because if the government just accepts all the demand from lobbying groups, I mean, it doesn't have the autonomy. It's basically a servant to the private sector. But then, sometimes it's good that the government does things for the private sector, but very often what it has to do is, okay, you want this, but this is not compatible with our broader social goal. Yeah? You want this, but this will actually, in the long run, destroy you rather than help you. Yeah? So the government has to work in the broader social interest, and actually constraining the cooperation between private sector agents in certain areas is another job of the government.
Good. About industry and industrial policy, you are well known for the defense of the industrial sector as a key for development. Under the dominance of free market policies, industrial policy was kind of banished from economic thinking and economic policy. But it's now returning a little to the discussions and being adopted not only by developing but also by developed economies. How do you see this movement?
Yes, there was a brief interest in industrial policy in economics in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Americans and Europeans realized that Japan's economic success, which was putting them on the defensive at the time, owed a lot to very effective industrial policy implemented by the Japanese government. So that there was a brief period when this was quite an important issue, but then you saw the rise of neoliberalism, which basically meant that industrial policy became a dirty word. That you're not supposed to discuss this. So having started my academic career writing about industrial policy, in the beginning I was treated very badly by other people, because this was not even an issue. Interestingly, yes, in the last say 10 years, industrial policy has come back for a number of reasons. The first reason was the rise of China, in which industrial policy also played a very important role. Of course, the Chinese industrial policy was rather different from the one used in Japan or Korea, because China had this benefit of huge size and very strong scientific base compared to its initial level of development and so on. So, I mean, it wasn't the same, but still, I mean, people realized, yes, I mean, yet another economic miracle based on aggressive industrial policy. So the people started paying attention. The second reason is this, laissez-faire, open trade, no state intervention kind of recommendation that was given to developing countries, especially those in Latin America. I mean, proved disastrous. I mean, the Latin American right love to talk about the disasters of import substitution, industrialization. In the 60s and 70s, per capita income in Latin America grew at 3.1% per year. In the next 35 years of neoliberalism and no industrial policy, per capita income in Latin America grew at 0.8%. I mean, it's actually quite shocking that this kind of false propaganda is accepted. Because even by the standard of neoliberalism, where growth is everything, it has vastly underperformed compared to import substitution industrialization. But people think that Latin America was a disaster in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, but 35 years of neoliberalism has produced nothing. So policymakers in developing countries started rethink this. And yes, indeed, in the last 5-6 years, I have had so many invitations from various types of developing countries to come and advise them on how to diversify and upgrade the economies out of primary commodities. So that there is definitely increased interest in this. And thirdly, I mean, there has been some change in the academia. So people like the Stiglitz, the Justin Lin, Danny Roderick, these are all mainstream economists, but have started arguing for some form of industrial policy. Of course, they wouldn't go as far, I mean, not even half as far as what people like myself and many others in the Unicamp would go. So they are very cautious, Justin Lin says, well, basically, you need to do industrial policy, but only to conform very closely to your underlying comparative advantage. So his recommendation is that you watch countries that have incomes that are 2-3 times higher than yours, and try to go into industries that they are specializing in. I mean, if you follow that recipe, South Korea would have never industrialized.
Would those policies be more sort of horizontal?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and another point is that these neoclassical economists that tend to recommend more horizontal policies. So support R&D, the improved business environment, and provide infrastructure rather than trying to intervene at the sectoral level. Now, I mean, when you think about it, this is a quite misleading formulation, this distinction between horizontal and vertical. Because things like R&D, infrastructure, skilled workers, they are very specialized according to the industry. There's no kind of general engineer who can work in every industry. Either you're an electronics engineer or chemical engineer. When you build the infrastructure, you build it in a specific location. And yeah, of course, the benefit is that broader, but whether you are building a railroad or the road link or airport, that will have very different implications for different industries. Because say if you are exporting iron ore, yes, you need railroad. The airplanes are no use for you. If you are growing flowers to be exported overnight to North America and Europe, you need airport. You cannot do it with the ships or railroad. So even infrastructure has different implications, and for different industries, and the R&D, yes, I mean that it is very specific to the industry, even specific to a particular product or technology. So there is no such thing as general R&D. So it's a matter of degree. So that in a way it's misleading the dichotomy, but accepting that there is some degree of difference in terms of targeting and the specificity of policy. These neoclassical economists generally recommend horizontal policies, and finally they wouldn't go into really foundational things like the government basically setting up a new industry by investing in research and development. Essentially the electronics industry was created by American military research. So computer, internet, they were developed by the Pentagon. Semiconductor was initially totally financed by U.S. Navy. GPS, that was also part of the defense research. So, government can create the whole range of industries by supporting non-profit making initially, the R&D projects. And, government can set up new agents, it can set up state-owned enterprises, it can, set up a research institute that supply technologies to smaller firms that do not have the capability to do R&D,
So sort of joint ventures.
Yeah, it could be joint venture, it could be, lots of different things actually happening when you actually look at the real world, but these mainstream economists do not talk about those things. So even though there is a greater recognition that for the need for industrial policy, they are very kind of conservative in their recommendation. And finally, of course, that after the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of the rich countries have experienced difficulties with their industries, and they've finally come to accept that they need to do something about it. Having said that, these countries are already doing a lot in terms of industrial policy, except that they were just not calling it industrial policy. The American government, even after adopting, the neoliberalism, kept financing R&D on a massive scale. At the height of the Cold War, the U.S. government funded between 50 and 70% of R&D in the nation. Even after the adoption of the neoliberalism, this ratio is at over 40%. It's South Korea, Japan. These are supposed to be far more state-led economies than the U.S. economy. The government finances only 20 to 25% of R&D. So the Americans have that massive industrial policy, only that it was called research, not industrial policy. Germans have been, doing a lot of industrial policy at the ground level, at the state level. The German government has done huge amount to promote its industries, but then, since it was not at the federal level, it looked like the Germans were not doing much industrial policy. So yes, a lot of that the industrial policy had been done, but there is increasing interest in the rich countries after the financial crisis and the rise of new industries, green energy, new materials, bioengineering, artificial intelligence. So a lot of the governments are basically being more open about the need for industrial policy. So yes, a lot of exciting changes, but how much can be done is not clear, because at the ideological level we are still very constrained by this neoclassical framework, and even the proponents of the industrial policy from the mainstream camp like Roderick and Lin and so on, they are rather conservative. They only look at and talk about the policies that are more or less compatible with the neoclassical framework. In practice, there are a lot of restrictions on what you can do because of the WTO, bilateral free trade agreements, the bilateral investment agreement. So yeah, I mean the increased interest in industrial policy doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be necessarily a lot more industrial policy in practice. But yes, I mean, I think that it's going to become more important.
You mentioned about some new industries, new technologies right now. So change that industry 4, the so-called industry 4.0 is expected to bring may also lead us to rethink development. Do you believe that potential change surrounding the new technological revolution would make catching up harder or easier for developing economies like Brazil?
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of these new technologies are still tentative, and some of them might lead to a dead end. So I'm not entirely in agreement with people who talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. But yeah, what is clear is that there are a lot of new technologies emerging, and that brings both opportunities and challenges to developing countries, because when there's this shift in technological paradigm, actually that you have this window of opportunity that late developing countries can enter these new industries and leapfrog the more advanced economies. So the best example of this is the Germans and the Americans entering the mechanical and electrical and chemical industries more aggressively than the British, and overtaking Britain as the leading industrial nations in the late 19th, early 20th century. Another good example is the East Asian economies getting into electronics earlier. I mean, of course, in the beginning as subcontractors and so on, but getting into electronics earlier than some of the advanced countries, and investing a lot to develop their capabilities in those industries, finally to become the leaders in these industries, is another very good example of how this leapfrogging can happen. So yes, with all these new technologies, the developing countries have this opportunity to leapfrog the more advanced countries, rather than having to always follow them. And already, the Chinese are, not quite world leader, but very advanced in solar panels. So they are more advanced than the Koreans in solar panels, even though their general level of technology is still 10, 15 years behind. So are there industries like that? The countries like Brazil can enter? Despite this the massive deindustrialization, I think this country can be proud of what it achieved in areas like airplane and Embraer, and deep sea drilling, Petrobras. So it certainly has those capabilities. So can it move into other new things? I hope so. Having said that, this the technological paradigm shift also creates the huge risks for developing countries, because in general, unless they really enter certain sectors and become world leaders, they are not the ones who control the evolution of these technologies. So the leading countries create these new industries which might wipe out the demand for things that developing countries produce. This has happened. When the Germans invented a way to basically chemically synthesize a lot of natural chemicals, a lot of Latin American industries were destroyed. When the Germans and the British invented the artificial dye, Guatemala had a huge hit because it had a near world monopoly, the crimson dye, cochineal, which lost this value hugely because now you could synthesize this. Yeah? I mean, when the Germans found a way to fix nitrogen in air and create ammonia and make it into fertilizer, the Chilean economy, which was heavily reliant on exporting bird guano, had a major setback. Yeah? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, someone might, develop a way to synthetically grow the soybean in 6 minutes instead of 6 months, and then it will be a huge hit for Brazil. Yeah? So let's see. I mean, there are opportunities and dangers, but hope Brazil can.
Yeah. And that reinforced the need to think about industrial.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Industrial
exactly. Yeah.
In face of this.
That's right. Yeah. So now you have to think. What are the technological trends, and where are the industries where our country could possibly enter and succeed, and what do we need to do in order to make that happen? Because it's not just going to happen because some, I don't know, guy sitting in a garage in Campinas has a brainwave and becomes next Bill Gates. No, Bill Gates exists only because there's a huge investment by the US military into electronics technology. So if Brazil wants to enter bioengineering, I mean, it needs to have a clear strategy. So it needs to invest in research infrastructure, recruit the best scientists, create companies that can use these technologies. Having scientists is not enough. I mean, for example, Britain invented, they hired this Russian scientist, so it's not even really British, but University of Manchester hired these two Russian scientists who created this new material called graphene. But the trouble is that Britain has no manufacturing company that wants to use this technology, so most of the practical patterns using graphene have been taken out by the Chinese and the Koreans and the Germans. So having just scientists is not enough. So you need to develop enterprises, you need to provide the infrastructure and the skilled workers to those enterprises. Yeah, so all of this need plan, which in short you can call the industrial policy.
And also to prevent that the existing industries may be somehow affected by this new technology. So in order not to lose their capacity to compete.
So that's right. Yeah, so
to readapt.
Exactly. On that front, you also need a plan because there will be some bits of your existing industries that may not be saved ever. Whatever you do. Then it's wiser to let it go quickly. But then if you let it go, then how are you going to deal with the social consequences of unemployment and lost skills and so on? So you need the program to convert these the workers into workers with other skills. That you then have to think whether some of the capabilities that used to exist in this industry could be used elsewhere. So I don't know, your steel industry that goes into decline, but then is there any way that the steel making technologies and people who are working in the steel industries could be used to develop other forms of new materials? Actually, the Korean steel company POSCO has already, I don't know whether they will necessarily succeed, but has already seen the writings on the wall and have already invested very heavily in developing new materials. So you need a plan. The one thing I might add at this point is it's really strange because when you are running a company, people expect you to have a plan. Where is your next move? What are you doing in terms of investment and training and research in order to make that happen? But when it comes to policymakers, people say no plan is the best plan. I find it really strange.
Definitely true. And finally, our last question. We would like to listen to you a bit more about the international economy. Our historical tradition here at the Institute of Economics has always been to look at both domestic and international levels, international factors, to try to understand development and our reality. Therefore, what would be your view about the post-crisis and apparently more fragmented world and the outlook for developing economies within the current international context?
Yes, well, I mean, even before the financial crisis, I mean, some fundamental shifts within the world economy had been happening. Yeah? So the rise of China is the most important thing. You know, I mean, at the end of the 1970s, Chinese economy barely accounted for 1.5% of world economy. Now it's 50%. And yeah, I mean, in general, the rise of Korea, Taiwan before China, and I mean, not as successful, but advances made by other Asian economies have distinctly shifted the world's economic weight towards Asia. But then also the other developing countries have been, increasing their importances. So yeah, definitely compared to say the 1940s and 50s, when the current world order was established, you have a huge rise of Asia and other developing regions and relative fall of the US and Europe. So that is at the international level creating tension, but I don't think this will really lead to, I mean, in the next 10 to 20 years, lead to a fundamental shift in the global power, because at least so far, China has been developing in a way that is totally integrated into the American and European economies. So, they have relied very heavily on exporting. For a country of China's size, I mean, its export dependence is huge. I mean, Brazil, the US, Japan, these large economies, they have actually very low dependence on trade. I mean, I think Brazil is the lowest, like only 13% of GDP is in international trade. In America, it's a bit higher, like 15%. I cannot remember whether it was Brazil or Japan which had the highest, lowest dependence on trade. But anyway, I mean that continental-sized countries tend to have very low trade dependence. In China, this dependence is like 30%. Considering its size is huge. So it needs to export to America and Europe. It also has bought huge amount of American government bond and so on. So this means that they have, at least in the near future, mutual interest in keeping the system going in the way that it has been going. But unfortunately, there are a lot of also uncertainties ahead, because first of all, after the 2008 financial crisis, basically the rich economies have propped up their economies through quantitative easing and other measures that have created huge asset bubbles. Now, when the interest rate begins to go up again, which will have to happen soon, then it could burst a lot of bubbles.
So do you think that would make developing economies more vulnerable in this sense?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the deal is that developed countries create trouble and developing countries suffer. No, because these guys can print their own money. US gets into financial trouble, it can print money. Argentina or Brazil has the financial trouble, it has to call in the IMF. Because no one's going to accept pesos or the reais in the international market. So yeah, these financial bubbles, when they burst, which will have to happen, but we don't unfortunately know the exact timing, the mode of bursting. But when this bursts, the developing countries will suffer. So that's one huge uncertainty that looming ahead of you. And then there are a lot of kind of uncertainties about especially the politics in the Middle East. I mean, already Trump saying that the US is pulling out of the nuclear agreement with Iran, is shooting oil prices up. So some countries will benefit. I mean, if you're Ecuador, this is a good news, but other countries that have to import oil will be very hard hit. So how is that going to change things? And finally, I mean, there are huge kind of potential for political disturbances in the rich countries. The so-called rise of the angry man, people who have been left behind in globalization. I mean, in most European countries now you have this extreme xenophobic right-wing parties, either in power or very close to power. You saw the election of Donald Trump in the United States, and I mean this is going to make politics very volatile and unpredictable. And it's difficult to predict where exactly it's going to lead to.
And that reinforced the idea we should keep an eye in the international economy and what's changing to understand our possibilities of development.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the rise of these right-wing parties, first of all, affects the willingness of the rich countries to accept immigrants. I mean, Brazil is not quite in that category, but a lot of countries rely on foreign aid from these the rich countries, and then the right-wing parties tend to say, well, we don't even have money to take care of our own people, so why should give money to African countries? So that's going to affect these economies, and also they will adopt commercial policies that more aggressively promote their own corporate interests. So in the current under the current conservative government in the United Kingdom, basically all the foreign aid is supposed to somehow promote British business interests. So that will change the way this money is used. So there are lots of the implications for developing countries from changes in the political settings in the rich countries. So you will have to watch out about that.
So, Professor Chang, thank you very much for this interview and for sharing your thoughts with the whole community of the Institute of Economics here at the Unicamp. That's an extremely, it's a unique opportunity, so many thanks again.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.